So my brothers and my sisters, as we embrace this urgency of creating the beloved community, now is the time to be love. Love means understanding, redemptive goodwill toward all which seeks nothing in return. So be love by implementing the demands of justice to eliminate the school to prison pipeline that has so many black children entrapped. Be love by correcting voting policies that seek to suppress the votes of millions of black and brown people. Be love and implement the demands of justice by transforming a society that is disproportionately violent toward black lives, including black transgendered lives and indigenous lives. Be love and correct false narratives and economic policies that continue to divide and pit poor and working class black and white people against each other. Be love and implement demands of justice where systems and structures are deconstructed and lead the way of living in community that reimagines just, humane, equitable, and sustainable policies, practices, and behaviors. Love your enemies. Bless them that curse you. Do good to them who hate you, and pray for them that despitefully use you and abuse you. Be love and do justice and love mercy and walk humbly with our God.
I just came from the U.S. I flew to Liberia.
Yeah.
And in 2 hours, guess what? I was in Ghana. And I just left Nigeria. I'm on my way to India.
Thank you.
So I will see you in India. Bye.
We are the beloved community in Atlanta and also in my native language, in our native language. It's called Pyara Bharat. Bharat is the name for India. What I would like to make a special mention, we want to thank the King Center for all their support always.
Hi, we're the beloved community and this is the Netherlands. Let me just tell you a bit about our table. So this is very typical for the Netherlands, the wooden shoe. It is mostly decorations, but we do have farmers that still use them.
And you are now
a samurai.
a samurai.
Oh, you're welcome.
Michael.
Okay.
We are the beloved community representing the Commonwealth of the Bahamas. If you look at our headpiece here, this is another festival. So these are our two largest festivals. This is our Junkanoo Festival, normally held in the winter during the month of December.
We are the beloved community.
Nous sommes la communauté bien-aimée.
We're from the Canadian Consulate, as I said, and we're so happy to be a part of this. We have books on display for children. We have Viola Desmond, who's the Rosa Parks of Canada.
We're here at the beloved community from Mexico. Bienvenidos a México. Estamos aquí con nuestra querida comunidad en el Martin Luther King Center y estamos platicándoles a todos, invitándolos a que vengan a México. We're inviting you all to come visit Mexico.
Hey, good afternoon and welcome. I'm Jeff Johnson. I'm thrilled to moderate this two-part Beloved Community Talks, Strategies for Beloved Community Education. During this two-part conversation, we're going to discuss practical strategies for transforming education and exploring education as a human right. Many of you know our education system is in a crisis and calls for major transformation in order for us to see a sustainable and just future are needed. Without students acquiring fundamental skills, both cognitive and socio-emotional, there's a critical lack of basic human development, not only for employment, but innovative solutions and proficiency on a global landscape. We're experiencing what is called learning poverty, and it can have rippling effects if we fail to swiftly repair and prepare for emerging global trends. In the words of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., I have the audacity to believe that people everywhere can have 3 meals a day for their bodies, education, and culture for their minds, and dignity, equality, and freedom for their spirits. Dr. King also compelled us to understand that true education strengthens intelligence and character. He said the function of education is to teach one to think intensively and to think critically. Intelligence plus character, that is the goal of true education. It's evident that we're experiencing a deficit in developing strategies to focus on intelligence and character, beginning with our legislation regarding education and reflecting in how we train to engage our next generation. We simply are not holistically and collectively committed to creating beloved community education, but that is about to change. Today, we're going to discuss key factors contributing to the education crisis and the impact of the crisis on our students and wider society. We will also explore pathways to transforming the educational system and creating a beloved community education. Joining us is an illustrious body of education leaders with a wealth of knowledge and experience on the issue. I'm excited to be able to moderate this expert panel through a conversation that is critically needed. First, we have Dr. Nardos King, is the president of the National Alliance of Black School Educators, with a mission of improving the educational experiences and outcomes for Black students through professional development and advocacy for policies and equity that benefit both students and educators. Prior to this role, she served in senior leadership positions in 2 large school districts. Also joining us, Dr. Nancy Gutierrez is the president and CEO of the NYC Leadership Academy, dedicated to cultivating culturally responsive leadership in schools and system leaders. A former teacher and award-winning principal, she teaches at NYU, Harvard Principal's Center Institute for School Turnaround Leaders, Urban School Leaders, and Race, Equity, Access, and Leadership. And lastly, Dr. Chad Womack is the Vice President of National STEM Programs and Tech Initiatives at the UNCF and the founding director of the UNCF STEM Scholars Program. Prior to UNCF, Dr. Womack led the White House-supported HBCU Startup and Innovation Initiative, U.S. Department of Commerce, and more, and is the founder of nonprofits CS4 Philly and Black Tech Ventures. Welcome to each of you, and I'm really excited to be with you. We're talking about strategies for beloved community education. And I want to explore for a second what the beloved community education are. Ms. Coretta Scott King, founder of the King Center, described the beloved community as a realistic vision of an achievable society. She also said that in the beloved community, caring and compassion drive political policies, and that the beloved community is a state of heart and mind, a spirit of hope and goodwill that transcends all boundaries and barriers, embraces all creation. As you all think about the complexity of a beloved community, as well as the opportunity, what does that mean for you? Dr. Gutierrez, I'd love to start with you.
Absolutely. And thank you for the opportunity to be here. Really honored. You know, first of all, that intro, oh my goodness, chills. And, you know, when I think about those 2 words, beloved and community, I think about, reminds us of the humanity of the work in education, the humanity that is missing often from the work, from schools because of all of the things we get bogged down. We forget that we are serving human beings, we're supporting. There's humanity is at the very core of the work we do. And we've decided in many ways who deserves to be beloved and who doesn't. If you look up the word, you will see that the definition of it is dearly loved. Who deserves to be dearly loved? And we've made decisions that we can see, whether implicitly or explicitly, in the outcomes that we have. And also the word community is powerful. I think about collective care. I think about how during COVID, folks were out for themselves in many ways. I'm going to take care of me, my own. I'm going to get first in line for that, vaccine, whatever it was. And we really need to come and center ourselves back in community. And I think about Cesar Chavez's words, who says that we cannot seek achievement for ourselves and forget about our people, our home, our community. And so that's what it means to me, really the reminder of the humanity that is the foundation of education and the way in which we are responsible for each other, not only ourselves, but the collective.
Dr. King, I'd love for you to come in here, because I think Dr. Gutierrez makes a great point, and it's one that we almost think shouldn't have to be raised. And that's one of humanity, and whether it's the humanity of the babies that walk through the door of every school in the country, whether it's the teachers that are sacrificing in many cases to be there despite lack of resources, whether it's the families and the parents that are doing everything they can to make sure that when the kids walk through the door, they have the things we need. I'm curious, where do you think we began to lose sight of the humanity of the various actors that make up our public education system?
Thank you for that question, Jeff. I have a strong belief that in the last couple of years, outside forces are engaging with schools, school systems, policymakers in ways that take away from people seeing our children as humane, right? And I think about a beloved community education that should be rooted in creating holistic and inclusive learning spaces where empathy, understanding, and social justice are at the forefront, right? It starts with creating curriculum that not only educates, but also fosters a sense of global citizenship and responsibility. And somehow we've moved away from that. And, politics has made its way into schools in ways that are not beneficial to affirming each child who walks through the doors of a schoolhouse. So, we need to get back to focusing on building bridges, not just between students, but with a wider world, embracing diversity and fostering understanding. And I think it begins with every individual, educators, parents, and community members making a commitment to value each student and to promote a culture of inclusivity and care.
And I love that, and I'm with you, and I am constantly looking at lawmakers who don't seem to be interested in any of that. And so whether we're talking about state legislators that are driving curriculum that is not only historically inaccurate, but also a curriculum that doesn't really seem to care about young people being able to compete within a global economy in a way that is effective. Dr. Womack, I'm curious to come to you on two levels, because as we talk about the effectiveness or lack thereof of the existing system by way of simple delivery and pedagogy, we also are recognizing that even within the technology that we're using, it is imperfect people with their own biases utilizing technology that in turn becomes bias. And so I'm curious, from your vantage point, what are the ways that we need to be thinking about using technology differently in order to ensure not only delivery of education services to our children and families, but effective utilization for them to maximize dreams?
Well, first, let me say thank you, Jeff, for mediating and moderating this discussion. I think Dr. Gutierrez and Dr. King's comments are a hard act to follow because they were so wonderfully elocuted, and I think articulated a lot of what I would say about the spirit of what a beloved community is about. And I think the answer to the question is within the name itself. Beloved community is about being loved. and being in a space where one is caring and sharing with others in the spirit that Dr. King and the King family have so wonderfully shown us over the years. But I want to answer your question somewhat circuitously, and I apologize in advance. But I want to bring in the community from the angle of historically Black colleges and universities.
Sure.
I am a proud graduate of Morehouse College, Morehouse School of Medicine. My parents went to the first HBCU, Cheney State, used to be Cheney State Teachers College, now Cheney University. And I work for the UNCF, which has now almost in its 80th year been investing in historically Black colleges and universities for decades. And I mention HBCUs because at the core of the HBCU experience is love and compassion and empathy for African American students. It is where I was nurtured as a young man, following in feebly, I should say, in the footsteps of some great men like Martin Luther King and Andrew Young and many others who traversed the campus that I walked on as a student. But all of us who've had that HBCU experience know how special that is, because at the center of it is a deep love and concern for understanding how this world, as crazy as it is, works. In some cases, doesn't work. And I think the true mark of education is not just content knowledge, meaning you know stuff, but that you are imbued with a spirit to try to change the world and make it a better place for the next generation. And so I think part of the answer to your question, Jeff, around technology revolves around just that. How do we engage technology in such a way that we can use technology as a tool to better our world, to better our planet, better our communities? And certainly we are challenged with those things now with things like artificial intelligence and so forth and so on. But I hold on to the hope and faith that educating a mind and not the soul is part of the challenge that we face. We need to do both. We need smart people, but we also need large hearts and compassion as well.
Well, let me, I mean, you all have just really effectively communicated this notion of beloved community. And in listening to you all talk from three different places, that there's also this challenge and this tension of where does that love exist? I mean, I am the father of five. And when I take my kindergartner and first grader to school, there are teachers who I know love children. And there are teachers who I know who are there to get a check. And I don't always see a culture that mandates which needs to exist. And so when we think about this notion of love and creating even communities within our education system that are literally about not only loving our babies, loving the parents and the caretakers that drop them off, loving the communities in which the school exists, and frankly, loving a country that you want these children to come out of and be able to effectively engage in. How do we encourage love when policy and bare minimum qualification meeting exercises seem to be the priority of the day? Where do we intersect with policy, procedure, and standards to insert love in a way that becomes palpable? And we'd love for any of you to chime in. I know there's a lot in that question, so any of you dive right in.
I'll take a stab at it.
Thanks,
so Jeff, I believe that, more educators show love to their students than not every day. We've been back to school where I work for the past 2 weeks, and I've had the opportunity to visit classrooms, and it's evident, you see it, right? But we do recognize that in the last couple of years, the world culture has had an impact on our profession in ways like I haven't seen in my last 28 years in this profession. And I think, and I'm still a believer, that teachers show up to nurture our students, affirm who they are when they walk into their classrooms every day, and help them reach their dreams and goals. And I'm going to continue to believe that as long as I have an impact through my roles to ensure that that's happening for students. I'm currently the chief equity officer for a large district in Virginia. And, that's part of how I show up and how I put my voice at the table every day. So the expectation is to have both high standards for our teachers, high standard for our administrators, and high standards for our students, and high expectations for all three. And so as much as we see the doom and gloom, because that's what the media focuses on, there's still great things happening in schools every day. And I believe that parents are an important part of ensuring that that's the experience that their children has every day that they show up, by being an engaged partner in the learning experiences for their kids. So, I'm hopeful that we will continue to improve in areas of recruiting, highly talented teachers in our classrooms every day. But I do believe that the school systems that I'm close to and the superintendents that I know of across the country are ensuring that our students are still having those positive experiences and feeling the love. Does that mean everybody every day? Absolutely not. But I think the majority of our teachers show up to show that love in the classroom, and it's evident by the student success that we see each day. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Dr. King.
I'm with you, Dr. King, 100%. And, just as our students and our babies need love, our adults need love too, right? And the way we show love, the way we can show up and love on our adults is we invest in them. We build capacity, we develop, we ensure that they have what they need. When we talk about being responsive, culturally responsive, I know that's a trigger word, just responsive in any way, it means to the adults too. It means exactly what Dr. King said, the high expectations and also high support and affirmation of who they are and their ability to bring themselves to the space in the same way we want them to have kids bring. Now, it was about 20 years ago, right, where the research came out that said teacher is the single most important factor, right, in a child's life and child's education experience. Wallace did a study 2021, and it comes out school leader is as important, right? No secret that I'm going to hone in here on leadership, but not only is the leader as important, but the leader has even greater scale. And so I really believe when you ask this question, around what it means to create these cultures of love in places that, kids want to show up, that families feel really welcome, that, that people feel like, hey, this is a place I want to be every day and I want to dive into learning. I think that leadership is the biggest lever for change there, and that the leader holds a lot of weight on their shoulders to create those spaces. We know through this research that means higher teacher satisfaction, less exclusionary discipline, lower teacher turnover, higher outcomes for students. And so just want to hone in a little bit on the impact and scale on the leader's shoulders.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I want to add to that, only to say that I just actually, before logging on for this conversation, I just left a small but wonderful group of educational leaders. And we all met this afternoon for 4 hours to talk about how much we are deeply concerned about the state of K-12 education, in particular for African-American kids. Mm-hmm. And while we all had different perspectives, we were centered on the love for our community and trying to figure out how to establish and create a different learning environment that would allow our young folks to thrive in a society that's increasingly being driven by technology and innovation and all the things that we are concerned about. And I'll just say, I couldn't agree more with Dr. King's comment and Dr. Gutierrez's comments about teachers and leaders. We definitely need an all-in approach where people lean into the K-12 community environment, not just make the assumption that schools and principals and superintendents can do it all by themselves. They need a partnership with the parents, with stakeholders in the community to make schools work. But I think there's hope in that, and I would agree with Dr. King that there's more teachers than not who do care, who wake up every day, just like my mother and father woke up every day, with nothing but love in their hearts and deep concern and commitment to make sure that they were educating young folks.
Well, and to that, and I appreciate you all for one, just I think elevating the reality that regardless of what the statistics say, that there are people on the ground every day that defy those, and that connect in a way that is beyond what any news story is going to say about what's happening in a school. But we do know that every teacher and every school leader doesn't have the same resources at their disposal to ensure that that school can be high performing. And there's a reality of school buildings that can't be open past a certain degree in the winter or summer because they're not safe. We know that there's a reality of what technology tools and equipment is available depending on what school you're in. And so this notion of equity is very real, and all of you are dealing with it at different levels. Dr. Womack, I'd love for you to chime in first here by way of where you believe one of the equity challenges are currently as it relates to K through 12 in particular, and what are some of the solutions at play or those that you think need to be developed in order to make equity for the issue that you're thinking about a reality?
Yeah, Jeff, that's a brilliantly articulated question. Let me say this. I do think that the problem is deep enough that requires a collective impact approach where the solution is not hoisted on the shoulders of an individual or a single organization or a school district for that matter. I really do think we need to rethink our strategies and approach to transforming the K-12 learning environments that brings in multiple stakeholders, whether it's private sector, industry has a role to play in this, higher ed has a role to play in this, the community has a role to play. And I think the people that I'm privileged and blessed to work with, like the group that we met with this afternoon, are reflective of the deep concern, not just of one small group, but of a larger group of African Americans and others who in their communities see the impact of a lack of opportunity and, to your point about the inequities, the structural inequities, infrastructure that needs to be rebuilt. I live and I'm born and raised and live in the city of Philadelphia. So I understand exactly what you mean when you say buildings that can't be opened or have to be shut down because of asbestos or lack this or that. But it's interesting. I once had a conversation with a brilliant scientist from India, and she had come to this country to raise her kids as an immigrant and was practicing her research in the same research center I was in. And we had this conversation about K-12, and she said, look, I grew up in India, and for me, a chalkboard, a piece of chalk, and somewhere to sit was a classroom for me. Just to put it into some global perspective, we have a lot in this country that we take for granted. And it's a hard thing, I think, when we look at some school districts who have plenty and some that don't have as much. And we say, well, there's this gap, and that is true. But I think we need to reinvest, all of us need to reinvest in K-12. We need to bring resources in partnership with school districts and superintendents and leaders. And in some cases, have those hard discussions about what does a loving yet rigorous academic environment look like? Because we know it's going to look different. And sometimes educators can be somewhat resistant to change. But I do think there are people in school districts and systems that are looking for solutions that they can be part of. And so I think that's part of the answer, is being able to work with them as partners and collaborators. But we definitely need the community. We definitely need parents involved. And we definitely need other sectors of our society to weigh in and be partners in this effort.
Dr. Gutierrez, I want to kind of build on what I'm hearing Dr. Womack say, and you can tell me if I'm being unsophisticated in how I look at this. But there is a reality that I think few people would say that there's not some kind of transformation that's needed. It seems like agreement on transformation gets caught up in political circles that's driven by ideology more than data, that's driven by political desire versus a strategy that prepares kids for a global marketplace and a successful life. And so I'm curious, what do you think is the that straw that will break the camel's back, that says, wait a minute, so much of the infighting that has been driven by everything except our babies and what their futures are has to be removed, not only for equity's sake, because if we're honest, there are quote unquote high performing schools in our country that in K through 12 that aren't adequately preparing kids to be able to compete in a global marketplace. And so what's the straw that's going to break the camel's back that says our schools need an overhaul in a way that we frankly haven't seen in the last 50 years?
It's a great question. And it is certainly a challenge I think all of us are thinking about today. And, you know, if I think, for example, about the fight about words themselves, right? Like if we were to say, let's make sure that every kid gets what they need to be successful, no one would argue. It is hard to argue with when we get very specifically in defining, and we're in some ways in this conversation, as we're all trying to transform and we all have our ideas about it, we're missing each other. We're missing each other in rhetoric. We're missing each other in, in many ways, if we were to begin to ask, the 5 why protocols, ask someone why 5 times, ask them to really explain, what's going on. We likely don't disagree about a lot. And yet we have been unable to have the conversations we need to determine where we need to shift. Now, I just had the honor the past few days of reading Honig Irani's new book, which will come out in November, called From Tinkering to Transformation. It's not out yet, but I endorsed it. And so I had to read through it. And there were a few really cool findings. And one was, and these are things that we know, but maybe aren't named. And I felt like they named them in ways that were really tangible. For example, one of the finding was that in systems, there's often no unifying vision. It's not that the superintendent or the leader doesn't have a vision. It's that people don't feel connected to it. It's that if you go down, if you have any system and you go to, if you go to Miss Jones' 3rd grade classroom, is that teacher connected to the vision of the person leading the entire system? When you can't thread it through, right, then we're all kind of working in different directions. Another finding was that, and this is not a big, surprise, but that, there was a lot of time spent on non-strategic work, right? Lots of being reactive, but not necessarily centering high quality teaching and learning. And so, there's a lot happening in school systems that in some ways haven't been named in ways that we can actually talk in a real way about what needs to change. And the other piece too, I think that's coming up for me is, in this book, the question they keep asking is like, what would it mean to start from a blank page? Like, would we even know what to do? Would we know? Because we have the answers. We've done a lot of this work. We have the research. We know what high expectations look like. We know that students need to be affirmed in their identities and they need to feel a sense of belonging in order to connected to the teacher and the principal to do well. We know that teachers of color and principals of color matter. We know all of these things. And so, what would it mean to start from a blank page and really rethink how we're engaging and rally everyone behind a unifying vision that we can all follow?
Dr. King, I want to get a little bit more specific because as I think about beloved community and I think about our communities in particular, I often find that educators are often unfairly positioned to diagnose things they can't diagnose. I've got a son who's dyslexic, and if it wasn't for a teacher that had the ability to see some things and talk to our family about what they were seeing in Miles, I don't know if we would have gotten to that diagnosis as quickly as we did. I also know that my family can afford to pay for a psychoeducational analysis to identify where Miles was on this spectrum of process. So I'm curious, even as we continue to talk about equity, what do we need to equip educators within the classroom to be able to diagnose learning differences, to be able to support individualized program and study, which we know works. As we think about all the things our babies need and that are often at a school in a more expensive zip code or at an independent school that doesn't exist within the rank and file K through 12 school, how are you all thinking about that? What are some things that you're seeing by way of movement, and what are things that people can support? Because again, Dr. Womack talked about the complexity of this notion of equity. We could have a 3-hour conversation on just half of the areas of equity, but I'm just curious as it relates to learning difference, individualized program, those things that we know are effective to targeting a certain population of our students who can be successful if we just saw them.
Yeah, Jeff, I hear what you're asking, and that question alone is complex, right? Because I think what it's going to take to change the educational system is courage. Courage to be the first to step out and step out knowing you might fail, right? Because everybody's watching you do something different. We're all continuing to do the same thing, but we all know, everybody in this K-12 space knows that we need to be doing things differently. We are preparing students for jobs that are not going to exist in the next 5 to 10 years because we haven't had the courage to say, we're going to stop doing this and start learning how to do this, right? So I think that we need to shift the education system from a one-size-fits-all factory model to a more individualized, future-thinking approach. When we do that, we will begin to see innovation show up in spaces, right? Because you cannot be innovative if you continue to do the same things that we've been doing since the industrial age. And I think that this profession is probably the last one to change and adapt to the world in ways that are making differences for students like your son, right? There are teachers who are equipped to recognize when students need extra support. We already do that now. But how do we embrace AI to help us advance what we can put in front of students who may have learning differences to help catch them up or close the gaps that are created by those learning differences? You hear on the news every day about how artificial intelligence is starting to show up in schools, right? It was first brought to our attention because our students found out about it before we knew about it, right? Because the babies are going to lead the way. And if we don't start to create spaces where the babies can lead and, use the critical thinking skills that we so badly want them to have to help shape their futures, because we're afraid of what does that mean, right? Instead of really sitting down and focusing together, bringing partners across the spectrum, like Dr. Womack said, bringing industry partners in to say, how can education look different so that we can use the talents of each of our students to make the world better in the next, 5, 10, 20, 30 years. And I think that, we should be focusing on strengthening soft skills in our students, like empathy and cross-cultural understanding and collaboration. I think all of those are as equally important to reading, writing, and arithmetic, right? And I think that literacy is something that we don't focus on, particularly in our community. And literacy is the game changer for our students in school, right? If we focus on literacy and ensuring that each of our students are prepared for preschool or kindergarten in our communities, then it doesn't matter what we put in front of them, because they're going to be able to use those critical thinking skills to get what they need to be successful. And so I'm not sure if I specifically answered your question, but I do believe the word courage needs to show up in these spaces, because that's what it's going to take for that superintendent leading a district somewhere across the country that's going to be the first to say, we're not going to look like this anymore. We're going to look different, and we're going to start taking action to look different.
Well, I think you addressed it, and it was meant to be a complex question. So I appreciated how you laid that out, and I think that courage is a good segue to this reality that we know 16 states that have laws or policy in place that limit lessons about race and inequality being taught in K through 12. And it does not look like this ball is going to stop rolling anytime soon. And so I'm sometimes I think we get distracted by the wrong debate. And so I'm actually curious, what do you all believe is the immediate impact of us starting to talk about historical fact that can't be discussed within an educational environment, and what are some of the more treacherous long-term implications if this trend remains the same?
I think it's a great question. We're in a very weird space in this country. On the one hand, technology is gallivanting forward and driving us towards a more sophisticated reality in terms of how education is formulated and delivered. COVID accelerated that. And the impact on school districts, teachers, school administrators, I think, was tremendous. And we're still feeling the ripple effects from COVID. Meanwhile, as you mentioned, Jeff, we're going backwards. This country is in retrograde with regards to culture and our historical understandings of who we are as Americans. We continue to lie to ourselves about our own history in ways that is so detrimental for our young folks, who require the adults in the room to give them the truth about who we are, good, bad, and ugly. We need to tell them the truth, but with the hope and faith that we can survive it. And I do think that is the role of education. I think one direct impact that this era of neglect and denial is having is, in some ways, it's forcing Black and Brown communities to sort of take control or the agency over telling their own stories, their own historical narratives to their own young folks, and not be dependent on the institutions to do that for us. Albeit, our public schools and school systems have a public mandate to do so. I still think it's up to us as the adults and the parents and the uncles and aunts and so forth in our own respective communities to begin to educate ourselves about our own history in such a way that we can share that with our young folks. I have 2 kids, and they know that their father is concerned about what's going on. They understand a little bit. I want them to learn more about their history, but we've set them on a path of lifelong learning about who they are as Africans in America, and understanding the diasporic aspect of that. So I think it is incumbent upon us to begin to codify our history and put the historical context of what it means to be Black in this country, brown in this country, so that we can then pass it on for generations. And so perhaps there's some silver lining to this, if I can call it that maybe this is a I don't know, impetus for us to begin to codify it so that we have something actually to pass on.
Yeah. And I very much appreciate that. I think one of the concerns for me is that, people talk about the quote unquote original sin being slavery. And I actually think the original sin was removing the contribution of continental Africans from the foundation of civilization. And the moment you tell other people that a group didn't contribute to the foundation of society means they're freeloading, and they are in turn less than those cultures that contributed to the foundation of society. I'm more concerned about the long-term impact of not telling this truth on white kids, on privileged kids who are disconnected from some of, I think, that silver lining that I very much agree with, that if we do things the right way. And so what are the long-term implications for a society that actually needs to have an understanding of that story to see people, let alone understand the truth of the country that they come from?
This is, it's reminded me of schools truly serve as the nucleus of our communities, right? They truly serve as a way to bring people together. And it's reminding me of the need for both affinity and bridging spaces, which we often don't do enough. Right. I mean, I like being in my bubble. I don't, as every once in a while, I just want to stay right in there. And yet that overall does not help, progress the conversation that is so hard to have, that is so complex to have with people who think differently than I do. And and so our schools, if we talk about one skill, a very specific skill that the adults at the schools, teachers, principals who need to learn, it's how do you create spaces for bridging, across difference, for sharing identities, for sharing stories, for, it goes back to, I think Dr. King said at the very beginning around, how we are bringing, like that humanity back into the classroom. And it feels like that is missing. And to your point around long-term effects, I mean, who wants to be a teacher right now? Who wants to be a principal? I mean, first of all, we didn't respect the role before all of this craziness started. And can you imagine being in that seat right now and having, on top of your role and your duty, and on top of already your professional already not being elevated and compensated in ways that fit your expertise, imagine all of this on top of that. And so talk about long-term effects. I mean, I think on the flip side, we learned during COVID that we know how to innovate fast. To your point, Dr. King, earlier about like, can we set some new innovative goals and just go for it and have the courage to take risks and to experiment. We know, remember ACT and SAT, students couldn't sit in the same room together. Do you know how many doors that knocked down? Like, do you know that we had so many new applicants and so many new, undergrads who came in from non-traditional backgrounds because that barrier was no longer in the way for a short period of time? Or if we think about like some of the AP exams becoming project-based, like, we were able to do things fast, everyone getting a laptop, or, Harvard for the first time has a master's online program, at the ed school, like something that we didn't think would ever happen. All these things happening, giving more access because of innovation. So we know we can do it. And it's about, right. It's about exactly, Dr. King, taking the risk.
Dr. King, I'm finding it interesting, so much of the conversation around this notion of history, race, seems to be about how people feel about the history. Is there a way that we make sure that this conversation is rooted in historical fact versus rooted in emotion about the history, to change the narrative about what this conversation is about? Or are we destined just to have to fight in a way to counteract the policies that we're seeing to get to a place where we can be reasonable?
Jeff, I believe that historians and educators deal in fact, right? It's the politicians who are dealing in emotions and bringing that into this space. Never before, right? I believe you said it was 16 states now have policies that forbid people or children to learn about facts that happened in this country. And what we're finding is that there are a lot more facts that we didn't learn about when when the four of us were in school, right? And so I think, Jeff, we're going to have to fight. You know, because the narrative is not ours. The narrative is being pushed into our spaces, but the narrative has never been emotional on our side. It has always been factual, maybe taught in sometimes an emotional way because the topics are hard. It's hard to learn about the ugly parts of this place we call America, the land of the free and the home of the brave, right? We weren't all always free, and we weren't all always brave, because brave people don't mistreat people. And so, you know, I don't think that I do believe that we're going to have to fight, and I'm hopeful that the young people will, you know, take the baton and fight for their right to learn about the history of this country the way it happened. And I'm not focusing just on Black children. I'm focusing on all children that have the right to learn about the good, the bad, and the ugly of this country and where we are today. Because if we don't allow that to happen, then the ugly can be easily repeated.
So you all talked about this a little bit earlier, and Dr. King, you in particular talked about the need to be courageous and transformation. I live in Baltimore. I'm looking at a city where you have less than 50% of the high school graduates going on to a 4-year degree. And what, as we think about what the purpose of K through 12 is in this next iteration or transformation, is definitely not what it was 50 years ago. And so I'm curious, models that you're seeing, that you're excited about, that are dealing with preparing kids for a future through the lens of a changing global marketplace than preparing kids for college. And what does that look like for our community in particular, as we think about what's the narrative that we're giving to families and young people about the purpose of education in 2023, leading into a 2050 global economy that we didn't do when we were coming up through K through 12.
Yeah, Jeff, let me take that question, perhaps a slightly different perspective, because I think what your question is asking touches on a few assumptions about the American educational model, and we can perhaps argue about this a bit. But from my perspective, the American, what we call the K-12 educational system, was never really built to truly educate our young folks. It was a utilitarian approach to preparing young folks for what then was mostly a farming and heavy industrial economy. But we also want to and should acknowledge the fact that we as Black folk have been here before. You know, at the turn of the Civil War, at the end of it, and the beginning of the period before, just before Reconstruction, you know, can you imagine being an ex-slave, trying to figure out how you're going to survive in a society that has already demonstrated doesn't like you all that much, but yet has all of a sudden catapulted you into an environment and an economy that you're ill prepared for. Yet our response, which I'm very proud of, which gives me hope, the candle in the dark, if you will, was to build community. and to build institutions like HBCUs, like fraternities and sororities, as a response to and a bulwark against a very hateful society that was almost hell-bent on making sure that we didn't make progress. Yet we did.
Mhm.
So I want to suggest that we've been here before. It looks a little different. It sounds a little different. The speed at which change is happening certainly is faster and will continue to accelerate with convergence of technologies and innovation and so forth. But I don't want us to lose hope that we can't effectively respond to the challenges that this new economy brings. There are those of us who are working very, very hard to build new platforms, new educational approaches, formulations that will allow our young folks to be what I call computationally ready for the new technologically sophisticated innovation economy. This country now has embarked on a major project to onshore chip manufacturing and onshoring all the various components of the semiconductor industry so that we remain competitive and not dependent on others. But we ran into a problem because in doing so, we realized that, oh, we don't really have a workforce for that. Oh, we haven't really prepared our K-12 systems and even our higher ed systems to address the need for much greater chip manufacturing capacity. But I see this
Well,
as
listen,
our
I'm from Ohio, so I
Right.
know that what's
Right.
happening in Columbus is in direct response to that. I
Correct.
guess, and actually, I don't disagree with you. So that's not something we have to argue. I think the question for me, especially as we just got a couple of minutes left, is we know that we've got shortages in nursing, we've got shortages in welding, we've got shortages of future to work is a very real crisis issue. And K through 12 often is focused, at least from a narrative perspective. We all know that there are K through 12 institutions that are diving into specialized instruction, but there's still an overwhelming narrative that college is the yellow brick road to success, when the marketplace is saying certification is a yellow brick road to success. And so what in 2 minutes, Dr. Gutierrez, is this answer to how are we finding the happy medium and meeting multiple students' needs, as well as really acknowledging the preparation needs for the marketplace and the need that exists within it?
It's a great question. And Dr. King named it earlier around really having to personalize the learning, make it individual. That means that we have to actually know kids really well and know families really well in order to meet needs. It goes back to the definition of equity, give every single student what they need to be successful. Be responsive as adults to the needs that are before us. That means that we have to stay fresh. We have to know what we're doing. We have to make sure that we are staying cutting edge to be able to meet those needs. And always ask the young people. Always ask. I'm an older mom. I have a 1-year-old, and all we had to do was follow him around to see what we needed childproof. Right? They will tell us exactly what is needed to meet their needs, and are we willing to listen to the truth? Not to the basic answers, not to the kids who always make us feel safe and comfortable, but to the real answers to the questions we are asking.
Well, and that's a perfect place to close. One, because we don't have any more time. Two, but it's an awesome
Sorry,
segue
Dr.
to the
King.
reality that our babies are always going to give us the right answers if we listen. I said I'm the father of 5, and so from my 24-year-old to my 4-year-old, they are constantly teaching lessons of what they need. And my biggest prayer is, God, don't let me mess them up. And the only way to do that is to truly listen to them. I am so thankful to have 3 powerhouses within the educational community that are not only listening to their intellect and their skill set, but also to the children and families and communities in which they're serving. Dr. Gutierrez, Dr. King, Dr. Womack, thank you so much. For those of you that are watching, We really appreciate you joining us for part 1, but hope that you'll join us on September 5th for part 2 of Strategies for Beloved Community Education as we expand the conversation into solution strategies for educational transformation, some of what we started to talk about today. We encourage you to continue the conversation in your families, in your neighborhoods, with your organizations, with other educators, with those who are committed to this issue. And please use the hashtag Beloved Community Talks or hashtag Education Matters to share on social media about what comes up in your talks this week. But more importantly than that, I think each of our panelists has said it very clearly. We got to love each other. And in loving each other, we hear each other. And in hearing each other, we can build with each other. And being able to build with each other, we can create what we cannot create alone. Thank you so much for joining us, and we'll check you out on September 5th.
Nonviolence is the answer to the crucial political and moral questions of our time. The need for man to overcome oppression and violence without resorting to violence and oppression. Man must evolve for all human conflict a method which rejects revenge, aggression, and retaliation. The foundation of such a method is love.
Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. changed the world when he demonstrated what could be achieved through nonviolence. Now, you can learn how to live and practice this philosophy yourself through Nonviolence 365 Online, an innovative digital experience developed by the Martin Luther King Jr. Center for Nonviolent Social Change. Nonviolence 365 Online features extensive video interviews with real nonviolence practitioners, including the King Center CEO Dr. Bernice A. King, King Center certified instructors and trainers, and veterans of the civil rights movement. Explorations of the historic campaigns that helped Dr. King forge his philosophy. Immersive, annotated reading experiences that enhance Dr. King's most influential writings on nonviolence. Custom activities, including quizzes and interactive scenarios to help you practice along the way. Real-world exercises to help you start applying nonviolence in your daily life. Nonviolence 365 is a love-centered way of thinking, speaking, engaging, and acting that leads to personal, cultural, and societal transformation. It isn't just a concept for philosophers or political leaders. Nonviolence 365 is a powerful, practical approach to dealing with conflict and dismantling injustice. Whether it's in your personal life, in your school or workplace, your local community, or a national movement. Dr. King, Mrs. Coretta Scott King, and many others sought to create the beloved community, a society built on global cooperation and equity. This wasn't a lofty utopian dream. It's a realistic and achievable goal because each and every one of us has the power to make it happen by committing to nonviolence as a way of life. Take the first step today with Nonviolence 365 Online.